Florence is a city full of romance, history, and culture. It has a picturesque landscape full of gently rolling hills, cypress and olive trees with villas, vineyards, and orchards scattered across, adding to its charm. But beneath this breathtaking vista lies the bloody of many corpses. And we're not just talking about the blood that ran through the streets of historical Florence. Deaths caused by religious wars, executions, and assassinations dealt by the extremely powerful Medici family. We're talking about something that happened more recently. From 1968 to 1985, the city of Florence was terrorized by a serial killer who murdered 16 people, pairs of lovers who were simply looking to spend some intimate time together around the hills of Tuscany. The crimes were gruesome and incomprehensible. For decades, the air was steeped in fear because no one knew when and where the killer will strike again. The only thing anyone was sure of was that he was familiar with the areas around Florence, and the targets were always couples. Today we'll be investigating Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence, the victims, the murders, and the numerous suspects to find out what most likely happened. On the night of August 21st, 1968, Barbara Locci went to the movies with her young son, Natalino, and her lover, Antonio Bianco. Barbara was a 32-year-old woman from Lastra a Signa. She was married to Stefano Mele. Antonio Blanco was also married and had 3 children. It wasn't a secret around the town that Barbara had lovers, even to her husband. That night, after watching the second show of the evening, the couple decided to stop by a nearby cemetery to have sex. The boy was asleep in the back seat at the time. While in the midst of taking off their clothes, a dark figure suddenly emerged from beside the car and shot both adults. It is unsure whether the child woke up and found his mother and her lover dead, or if the murderer carried him while he was asleep and left him at the doorstep of an isolated farmhouse. The owner of the house woke up due to a knock on the front door. It was Barbara's son, Natalino. He told the farmer that he is alone and tired. His father is sick while his mother and uncle were dead. He asked the farmer if he could take him back home. The authorities went to the crime scene and discovered the bodies of the 2 adults. They found 8 .22 caliber shell casings beside the car. When they arrived at Barbara's home that morning, they found Stefano stepping out of the house with a suitcase. He seemed to be in a hurry. When the police informed Stefano of his wife's murder, he didn't seem surprised or worried, so they brought him in for questioning. Though hesitant, Stefano agreed. At the station, he told the police that he hadn't been feeling well yesterday. Surprisingly, just a day after he was questioned, Stefano suddenly confessed to committing the murders. Based on this, Stefano was charged, convicted, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. Things were quiet for a while in Florence. Just when the public had almost forgotten about the double murder, another couple was found dead on September 15, 1974. It had been 6 years since the murders of Barbara and Antonio. Upon inspection, the police found that the man was shot multiple times inside the car. However, this time the woman was found outside the car with multiple stab wounds. The murderer was even vicious enough to use a vine to penetrate the woman's body. The bodies were identified as 18-year-old Stefania Pettini and 19-year-old Pasquale Gentilcore. The police had 3 suspects: Giuseppe Francini, a mentally unstable man who came to the police willingly and confessed to the crime; Bruno Macali, a 53-year-old man who claimed to be a healer; and Guido Giovannini, a man identified by several witnesses as a voyeur, spying on couples in the area where the murders took place. Unfortunately, the police couldn't find any evidence to link them to the crime, so they were eventually ruled out, and the case came to another standstill. Years passed, and once again, the people had all but forgotten about the 2 double murders. Until June 6, 1981, when a police sergeant out for a walk with his son accidentally discovered a car parked alongside the road with its driver's side window smashed. Inside, he found the body of a young man with his throat cut. The police later found another body at the bottom of a steep bank, just 20 yards away from the car. The victims were identified as 21-year-old Carmela De Nocho and her 30-year-old fiancé, Giovanni Foggi. Autopsies on both bodies revealed that the couple had died due to multiple gunshot wounds before they were stabbed and mutilated with a knife. Ballistic reports indicated that the gun used was a .22 caliber automatic pistol with Winchester rounds. One of the detectives remembered the old case and had the bullets compared to the ones from the 1974 murders. The bullets matched. This was the first time that the authorities realized they might be dealing with a serial killer. The main suspect at this point was Enzo Spalletti. He was an occasional voyeur, and his car was seen parked near the crime scene. He reportedly told his wife about the two dead bodies, as well as a copper-colored car as early as 9:30 in the morning. The story was only published the day after the murders were discovered. Though he gave an alibi, he was still arrested. A few months later, in October, another young couple was found murdered while parked at a scenic outlook near Calenzano, which is located north of Florence. The police identified them as 24-year-old Susanna Cambi and her 26-year-old boyfriend, Stefano Boldi. Both were shot multiple times and then stabbed as well as mutilated. The news of the murders had reached the press, which alerted possible witnesses to the crime. Two different couples approached the police, stating that they had seen a red Alfa GT with a lone male driver speeding away from the scene of the crime. This time, the police were able to find a clue: a size 44 shoe print found in the mud. This indicated that the suspect was a tall individual. As for Spalletti, he was in jail at the time of these murders, which caused the prosecutors to cancel his trial and release him. On June 19, 1982, another young couple was parked near the Via Nuova Virgilio provincial roadway. While making love in the car, someone suddenly started shooting at 22-year-old Paolo Mainardi and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Antonella Migliorini. Antonella died almost immediately. Though seriously injured, Paolo was able to start the car and shift it into reverse. Unfortunately, it ended up in a ditch and Paolo was unable to drive it out. The suspect continued to shoot at the couple until his bullets ran out. Because of the traffic on the road, the suspect decided to forego his mutilation ritual and ran away. Paolo was still alive. Unfortunately, he wasn't discovered until the following morning. He died hours later. He never regained consciousness. A few days after the murders, a sergeant named Francesco Fiori was assigned to the case. He remembered the murders of Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco way back in 1968. On a hunch, he insisted that the shells from that case be compared to the ones they found recently. The test revealed that the same weapon was used in both cases. If this was the case, then Stefano Mele, who had been convicted of the 1968 murders, was not guilty. Of course, it is also possible that he had an accomplice. But Mele insisted that he was innocent and refused to cooperate with the investigators. The assistant DA assigned to the case, Silvia Della Monica, wanted to trick the killer into making a move. So she asked reporters to publish a minor lie. She wanted them to say that Paolo was still alive when he arrived at the hospital and was able to provide a description of the killer. Her gamble paid off. One of the Red Cross emergency workers received 2 phone calls. The caller pretended to be the DA's office and then identified himself as the murderer. He wanted to know what Paolo said before he died. The Monster of Florence, as he was now called, went silent for a year. Then on September 9, 1983, 2 West German boys, Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, were shot to death while they were sleeping in their Volkswagen camper. They had parked it in a grassy clearing just 19 miles south of Florence. Though the boys were not mutilated like the previous victims, ballistic reports showed that the same gun was used to kill them. The investigators were baffled. Did the Monster of Florence make a mistake, or was he changing his pattern? Because one of the victims had long blonde hair, the investigators assumed that the killer had mistaken the boys for a young couple. After discovering his mistake, the killer might not have wanted to continue with his mutilation ritual and left the scene instead. Based on the investigation of all the murders, the investigators found several common elements. First, all of the victims had visited the discotheque on their last evenings. Second, the murders usually occurred on a Saturday. Third, the murders were committed on nights when the moon was hidden in the clouds. They also believed that the killer spent time rummaging through the belongings of the female victims, possibly because he wanted to get a souvenir of his crime. A short time after the two boys were murdered, the same Red Cross emergency worker received a phone call while on vacation in Rimini. It was the murderer. He wanted to know what Paolo told the police before he died. How did the Monster of Florence know who to contact and how to get in touch with him? More importantly, how did the killer find out that the worker was on vacation when he called? On July 29, 1984, the Monster of Florence struck again. This time it was Claudio Stefanacci, law student age 21, and Pia Gilda Rontini, barmaid and cheerleader, 18. The couple were killed in Claudio's car, which they had parked in a woodland area near Vicchio. According to Pia's friends, she had confided that an unpleasant man had been bothering her while she was working at the bar. The police also received several reports of a strange man that had been following the couple in an ice cream parlor some hours before they were murdered. Both victims were shot, while the girl had been mutilated as well. She had been slashed more than 100 times, and her left breast and genitals were removed. Ballistic reports indicated that the gun was the same as the one used in all previous murders. Because there were no fingerprints found yet again, the investigators concluded that the killer must have worn surgical gloves. Aside from this, the investigators had to admit that they had no substantial clues that could lead them to a suspect. They held little hope of ever catching the Monster of Florence. On September 8, 1985, the Monster of Florence struck again. A French couple, 25-year-old Jean-Michel Cravechvili and 36-year-old Nadine Moreau, were camped just outside of Florence in San Cassiano. Nadine's body was discovered inside a tent, while Jean-Michel was found around 30 yards from the tent. The investigators concluded that the killer had shot both while they were making love inside the tent. However, Jean-Michel was only superficially wounded and was able to run away. Unfortunately, he was overtaken by the killer and stabbed to death. Again, the Monster of Florence removed the woman's vagina and left breast. Right after discovering the bodies, the police got their first real lead. A copper-jacketed Winchester bullet was found on a sidewalk in front of a nearby hospital. The proximity to the hospital, along with the investigators' theory that the killer wore surgical gloves, led them to question the hospital staff. However, they didn't gain any other leads. A day after the murders, Assistant DA Silvia Della Monica received an envelope mailed to her office. Inside it was a sheet of paper folded over a small plastic bag. The bag contained a cube of flesh that was determined to be part of Nadine's left breast. The very next day, a group of 3 individuals walking a dog found tissue, hair, and surgeon's gloves in a bush. The items were taken to the police and tested. Unfortunately, DNA tests weren't available at the time. The only thing that the authorities could do was check the blood type. The human blood was type B. It didn't belong to either victim. Nadine had type A blood, while Jean-Michel had type O. Maybe it belonged to the killer. After the murders of Nadine and Jean-Michel, the Monster of Florence went silent. With no leads, the police could only look to outside help. They sent an unofficial request to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for a profile of the Monster of Florence. But the profile didn't help the police close the case. Though they had arrested and even tried a few men for the murders, the Monster of Florence remains unidentified to this day. The police had plenty of suspects throughout the various investigations. Unfortunately, all of them were released due to the murders that occurred while they were imprisoned. There were some who believed that the killings were done by a satanic cult. There's another theory that suggests the killer or killers were instigated to commit the murders. One freelance journalist named Francesco Amiconi even thought that the Monster of Florence was actually the Zodiac killer. Some believed that the murders were initially a clan killing led by Francesco Vinci, one of the lovers of the first female victim. It's just that one member of the group developed a taste for murder and continued the killing spree. And then there was Pietro Pacciani. Pacciani had been found guilty of murdering a traveling salesman in 1951. He had caught his fiancée uncovering her left breast to the man, which caused him to go crazy, killing the salesman and stomping his head in. Then he raped his fiancée next to the dead body. In 1987, Pacciani had also been convicted of the rape and domestic abuse of his 2 daughters. There is no doubt that Pacciani is an absolute monster. He is a drunkard, an abuser, a liar, and a shameless voyeur. But was he the monster? According to the police, they received an anonymous letter in 1985 that provided details about the monster killings that the public wasn't aware of. A computer analysis of the letter's content led the police to believe that Pietro Pacciani was the author. After some investigation, the police found that there were similarities between the 1951 murder and the killings committed by the Monster of Florence. Moreover, they learned that Pacciani had more than 157 million lira in cash and interest-bearing postal vouchers. He was a simple farmer. How did he get that much money? The police theorized that this wealth was his ill-gotten gains from the murders he committed. The police also found photographs of female genitalia in his home, as well as a newspaper piece about the murders and license plate numbers of Nadine Marriott and Jean-Michel Kravitchvili, the last 2 victims. More importantly, the police found an unfired bullet of the same brand as the monster in Pacciani's garden. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted of murdering 7 of the 8 couples killed by the Monster of Florence. However, this conviction was later overturned 2 years later. It was discovered that the bullet found had been planted by the police. The police was planning to have another go at Pacciani, this time with testimonies from his friends, who claimed to have been with him during the murders. Unfortunately, he died before he could be put on trial. Weirdly enough, Pacciani was found dead in his kitchen with his sweater wrapped around his neck and his pants pulled down to his ankles. According to the coroner, he had deathly levels of asthma drugs in his system. His 2 alleged accomplices, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, were both tried and convicted of the murders. They were condemned to life imprisonment. That being said, the families of the victims are still unsure whether the case has truly been solved. According to the profile, the killer was a white male of Italian origin, most likely to be a native in the area. He is comfortable moving about Florence and the suburbs surrounding it. It is likely that he has close ties to the place, probably even living in a place not far from where he committed the murders. The profile suggested that the killer was in his mid to late 20s when he began murdering people in 1968, which places him in his early to mid 40s by the time the profile was written. He has average intelligence and likely to be employed in a semi-skilled capacity requiring use of his hands. The FBI BSU unit's profile also states that the Monster of Florence most likely lives alone or with a family member who he is partially financially dependent on, such as a mother or grandmother. The killer has most likely served in the military and has little, if any, consensual sexual contact with women of his age. During the times that he was inactive, it is probable that he was residing elsewhere, or something occurred which prevented him from acting, such as serving in the military or imprisonment. According to the profile, the Monster of Florence acted alone and would not stop unless he is apprehended, incapacitated, or otherwise inhibited from acting. Among all the suspects in this case, Pacciani seems to fit the FBI profile best. However, there are also some details in the profile that can rule him out, such as the fact that Pacciani isn't sexually impotent. Quite the opposite, in fact. In addition, DNA collected from the anonymous letter didn't match his DNA. More importantly, there are many inconsistencies in the testimonies of his two buddies. So, what do we think most likely happened in this case? Though there are some details that seem to point to Pacciani, it's our opinion that the Monster of Florence is a person who has been overlooked by the police. The murders, though they seemed frenzied, were actually well planned. The consistency and preciseness of the manner in which all the murders were committed, as well as the fact that there were very few pieces of evidence collected by the police, suggests that the Monster of Florence is no ordinary Joe. It's not too far off to say that this killer is Italy's Jack the Ripper. We may never really know who he is. If you love our content and want to support the channel, feel free to check our web shop where you can find exclusive true crime merch brought to you by Bad Things.